There's nothing incoming. No alerts. No movement. Just a calm military sci-fi narrative starting now, paced for rest. They told me Theta 9 had been a bowl of ocean once, before someone boiled it dry and fused the surface into glass. I never saw the beneath, just the skin, dunes of black and translucent shards, edge on to the wind, singing when the pressure fronts shifted. The sound seeped through soup plating and bone, a distant, thin ringing that never entirely stopped. Most days I worked in a tent that might as well have been a cave. The lights stayed low to keep headaches manageable. Cables hung from the frame like roots. Cots were lined in 2 rows, bodies on them, some sleeping, some staring at the fabric ceiling, some strapped down. From the outside, it was just another field ward. From my side of it, it was an interface bay for the kinds of wounds that did not show on scans. I sat in the middle on a reinforced chair with a headrest, cranial socket exposed. My rig lay folded on a rack, a collar of composite and metal, fibers bundled at the back, needles wrapped, dampers locked. I tried not to look at it as anything but hardware. The more you anthropomorphize your tools, the easier it is to imagine they care what they do to people. Machines do not care. Command does not care. The only one who feels anything is the man who tightens the straps. They brought the officer in just before local dusk. I smelled outside, air pushed in with him, the dust filters struggling. His armor was intact, mostly clean, aside from impact scuffs and a smear of dried glass dust. He walked under his own power, but needed gentle pressure to stop and turn. The med techs laid him on the nearest cot and noted his vitals, heart rate, respiration, blood chemistry, all within margins for someone who had been moving on the plains. Pupils reactive, reflexes intact. He did not recognize his own name tag. I watched him for a while. Sometimes memory returns on its own, crawling up from whatever corner it fell into. His eyes tracked movement but did not fix on faces. When the med tech spoke to him, he tried to focus, then drifted away, attention slipping sideways as if pulled by a current only he could feel. An hour later, the order came through. Priority flag, command level authorization, attached clearance codes. Subject, recovered officer, rank equivalent to company command. Last known assignment, missing recon element. Objective, reconstruct operational pathway and locate missing troops. Authorized methods, unrestricted neural reconstruction using available interface assets. Risks to subject, acceptable. I read the lines twice. My hand trembled a little when I picked up the rig. Old damage along my left forearm flared, nerves remembering things my mind preferred not to revisit. I clamped the collar around my neck, felt the cold contact of the socket aligned with the port at the base of my skull. The world narrowed for a moment to the pressure of metal and the taste of saline at the back of my throat. He lay still as I adjusted the probes along his scalp. The medtech had shaved him fast. There were still short, coarse hairs under my fingers. His skin twitched under my touch, autonomic response. His eyes were open, unfocused, looking through me to the tent wall. I told myself he had already been lost by the time they brought him here, that I was not breaking anything that was not already broken. It is easier to step on glass if you convince yourself the shards came that way. I slid the final probe into place and keyed the rig to partial link. My own vision shimmered, a brief waterfall of static as filters came up online. Vitals popped into my peripheral awareness, his, mine, the ambient noise of the tent. I tightened the dampers to keep as much of myself on my side of the interface as possible. Then I went in. Initial contact with a damaged mind feels like stepping onto thin ice over deep water. You test the surface for give. You listen for cracks. There are always cracks. The question is where they lead. The first layer was just noise. Flecks of color, scraps of words without sound, texture without source, the brain's background clutter rising like dust. Beneath it, deeper were patterns. I pushed down, following the faint shadows of procedural memory, the simple, drilled sequences any soldier accumulates. Wake, suit, check seals, check weapon. Those sequences were present but eroded, steps missing, jumps where nothing should jump. I followed one of them, letting it lead me along. Suited hands sliding along a bulkhead rail, the subtle sway of a drop shuttle under thrusters, the metallic echo of boots on a ramp. Then the surface gave way. There was an impression of open air, of the glass plains under weak light, the twilight band stretching toward darkness. A formation moving ahead, armored figures reduced to silhouettes and HUD markings, their identity stripped even in memory. I saw through his eyes, but felt the distance. I was observing, not inhabiting. So far, he walked. They all walked. Glass crunched under boots. Dust hissed in the weak gravity. At the edges of the feed, instruments reported minor resonance spikes from subsurface formations. Nothing unusual. Theta 9 always hummed. The path bent toward a fracture in the plain, a long crack dropping into a deeper gloom. A descent line had been shot in. Anchors glowed faintly on his HUD. The formation secured the perimeter, then began to abseil down the glass face. Here the memory blurred. Surfaces wavered, edges sliding across each other like reflections in shaken water. I eased off, adjusted the rig's gain, then pushed again. The descent continued. Vertical glass on all sides, black and translucent layers banded like sediment. Helmet lights swept across surfaces that flickered with internal sheen. The resonance readings climbed. Numbers on the edge of his vision ticked upward, first in green, then amber. He noted it, filed it, kept moving. At the base of the fracture, the plane opened into an irregular chamber, a hollow where the glass had slumped and cooled in waves. In the center stood a structure that did not match the pattern of anything formed by heat and pressure. It rose in slender spines, converging and diverging, a frozen explosion of clear and black components, humming at frequencies outside conventional audio. The last clean frame was of that structure, outlined against the dark, every edge picked out by HUD feed and active scanning beams. Then the ice shattered. Pain is not supposed to transmit through the rig. Filters cut most of it away. The system reduces it to tagged events, flags it as physical overload, shields the operator. But this was not physical pain in the usual sense. It was modulation. It came in as pattern. The interface misread it as legitimate signal and let it through. For an instant, I was inside his skull at the moment something invisible hit it. The world rang. Noise like a note held far beyond any human capacity to produce. The chamber shook. His vision fractured into radial lines, everything splitting outward from the center of that impossible structure. Then nothing. Hard cutoff. No fade, no slide into unconsciousness, no transition. Just a wall. I recoiled, tearing myself out of a link faster than is recommended. The rig protested, buffers spiking. My heart hammered. Blood ran from my nose into my mouth, copper and salt. The tent came back around me slowly. Lights, cots, the distant murmur of the medtech on the far side of the bay. The officer lay where he had been, breathing shallowly, eyes now closed. Sweat had formed along his hairline under the probes. The first session gave me enough to form a path, a fracture in the glass, a landmark structure below. Coordinates could be triangulated from telemetry embedded in those last clear frames. Command would consider that a good outcome. I did not send my report immediately. I sat for a while, hands on my knees, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest. The ringing in my head did not subside. There was something in the blank at the end of the sequence, something not just absence, but presence denied. A day later, the answer came in the form of another order. Further dives required. Objective: extract detailed structural layout and enemy engagement pattern from subject's residual memory. Recon of missing unit's fate, secondary but desirable. Specialist authorized to push through terminal barriers if necessary. I read it and knew what it meant. If the path beyond that wall broke him, it would still be logged as mission success. The second dive went deeper. I increased link density, thinned my own filters. It is like stepping further out onto the ice, knowing that if it gives way, you are going into the water with whatever lies below. This time I did not approach from routine. I went directly to the fracture descent, locked onto the trajectory, and forced the sequence forward. Where the previous session had cut off, I applied pressure. The sound came first. A low, rising tone, like the planet itself inhaling. It built under the memory, filling cracks and gaps, resonating with them. The images shook, then stabilized. The structure in the center of the chamber glowed from within, veins of light crawling through its spines. Contact. I felt his body seize, muscles trying to contract against restraints that were not yet there. He fell without falling, balance destroyed by something acting directly on the vestibular system. Around him, his formation staggered, silhouettes locking in mid-step. Threads more delicate than spider silk extruded from the central structure. They were not visible in a conventional sense. The memory registered them as distortions in peripheral vision, a shimmer across the HUD. They touched helmets, chest plates, the exposed surfaces of neural cabling. Where they touched, they grew. The impressions came fast, layered, nearly unusable. Sudden warmth at the back of the skull, pressure along the spine. A sense of being opened, not surgically, but as if one's mind image had been unzipped. Thoughts pulled into strands, stretched thin, inspected, then slotted into place elsewhere. There were other minds present in that chamber. I felt the echo of them as the officer felt them. Blurred presences, half-formed impressions of fear and confusion and recognition. His men, maybe others from other operations. Their memories flickered in and out, replayed and recombined into some incomprehensible pattern. The structure in the center sang. The note rose, adjusted, settled, as if tuning a vast instrument made of nervous systems. In my chair, in the tent, my body shook. I kept the link open by force of habit and training. The rig threw warnings across my field of view: heart rate, blood pressure, neural load, filters failing to categorize incoming pattern as safe or unsafe. The officer's perspective narrowed to a tunnel. At the end of it, the structure pulsed in time with his heartbeat. With each pulse, something was taken, an image, a sound, a sequence of drilled instruction. With each pulse, something else was inserted, a coordinate, a vector, an orientation. The alien lattice was rewriting the pathways underpinning his memories, not to erase them, but to string them into new chains. I saw a map forming, not in conventional lines and symbols, but in associations. A certain taste in the mouth linked to the site of a particular ridgeline, the rhythm of marching steps tied to the echo pattern of a specific canyon. Behive was building a navigational matrix from human recollections, a living chart of everything the recon company had ever seen or heard. Then the perspective shattered again. The officer's conscious awareness collapsed, folded, and stacked into the lattice. The sequence dropped into a deeper, colder black than ordinary unconsciousness, a state beyond retrieval. I pulled out before I followed. Coming back was worse this time. My stomach cramped. I retched inside the suit and let the filters handle it. When my vision cleared, I realized I had slid halfway out of the chair. The rig's auto-release had triggered. The collar hung loose around my neck. The officer lay utterly still. The medtech had moved closer at some point. I saw their boots within my peripheral arc. They asked if I was functional. The words did not fully register. I filed the second report an hour later. It contained what command wanted: confirmation of capture, identification of a crystalline structure functioning as central node, evidence that missing personnel were being used as cognitive components. I did not include the detail that the patterns were not purely observational, that I had felt new associations being written into the officer's mind even as the old ones were stripped. This was not just interrogation, it was conversion. The strike order came that same cycle. Small element. Focused, low profile. A squad of infantry in full exosuits. One demolition specialist with shaped charges tuned for brittle medium. One signal operator with jammers covering our usual bands and a few experimental frequencies. And me. The plan was simple in the way plans only are when whoever wrote them will not be there to see them fail. We would approach the fracture using the path derived from the officer's memories, descend, plant charges around the central formation, exfiltrate, and collapse the chamber. We lifted just after local dawn. The sky on Theta 9 never changed much. The star's light came in at a low angle and stayed that way, smearing across the plains. From the shuttle window, the glass dunes looked almost fluid, like frozen waves. Our landing zone lay at the edge of the crack, a scar of darker material running off into shadow. Stepping onto the surface always felt wrong. The glass had enough give to respond to weight, an almost imperceptible flex. The shards slid underfoot with a sound like teeth grinding. Each step risked opening seams in suit soles. We moved in single file, visors mirrored, antennae retracted to minimize exposed protrusions. The jammers hummed faintly, radius indicators pulsing in the signal operator's HUD. My rig rode heavy on my spine, disconnected from any human target for the moment, but still tuned to pick up anomalous pattern. As we drew closer to the fracture, the background ringing intensified. It rose from the edge of perception to something that vibrated in bone. My teeth ached. The suit's acoustic dampers tried to null it, but it came in through direct contact with the ground, through the soles, up the legs, into the skeleton. The crack itself fell away steeply. Anchors from the original recon mission still marked the descent. Some had shattered. Others held, embedded in glass that had partially flowed around them under thermal cycling. We clipped onto what was left and went down. The light diminished fast. Suit lamps cut across layered glass, catching internal fractures and inclusions. The deeper we went, the more the surfaces around us reflected our own beams back in distorted patterns, like moving through a hall of mirrors that had been crushed and reassembled. My rig started to pick up low-frequency structure, regularities in the way the ringing modulated, patterns in the minor variations. Not language, nothing so simple. More like a surveillance system pinging its own nodes, checking integrity. The chamber at the bottom was as the memory had shown it, but more. In the officer's recorded perception, the central structure had been a frozen arrangement of spines. Now it was a cathedral of glass grown from glass. Spires reached up to the ceiling and down into the floor, interlaced. Veins of pale light ran through them, pulsing slowly. New struts had sprouted outward along the walls, embedded in the surrounding matrix as if feeding from it. Our lamps picked out shapes within the lattice. Armor segments, helmets, the faint outlines of human forms encased in clear mineral, not arranged ceremonially, not displayed, simply incorporated, like impurities trapped in ice. The jammers struggled. Their output showed as clean in our own short-range net, but the ambient ringing refused to shift. If anything, it grew more coherent, as if the act of jamming itself had been noticed and compensated for. The squad spread into a perimeter around the base of the structure. The demolition specialists began placing charges at calculated stress points. My task was to stand near the center and listen. The rig's sensors were more sensitive than suit mics. If there was a way to anticipate an attack vector, it would come through pattern first. I stood with gloved hands hanging at my sides and let the rig absorb. The ringing resolved into layers. Some spines carried high, almost inaudible threads. Others pulsed slow and deep. Together they formed a grid of resonant pathways. Occasionally a surge ran through them, a ripple of energy moving from one end of the chamber to the other. On one of those surges, I felt it notice us. There was no thought, no message, nothing I could translate. Just a shift in emphasis, a reallocation of attention. The frequencies around us deviated from their regular pattern, curving toward the center. I opened my mouth to warn the others and felt my tongue lock. Muscles seized from jaw to toes. My suit's diagnostics spiked, then blanked as something overwhelmed their ability to categorize. The first resonance hit arrived as a physical event. The ground vibrated at a frequency harmonized with the human skeleton. I heard bones creak inside the armor around me. Some snapped, sharp pops muffled by suit layers. Men fell without any obvious projectile having struck them. Internal organs ruptured in silence. My view spun as my own knees gave out. I watched the chamber tilt, the central structure sliding in and out of frame. At the edge of vision, a helmet visor snapped from the inside, spiderwebbing in an instant. I tried to move and found only a thin thread of control over my own breathing. The rest of my body belonged to whatever was playing it. Threads extruded again from the central lattice, visible this time even to the naked eye. Filaments of bright, refracted light, like flaws in the air, reaching out along paths of lowest resistance. They touched armor plates, helmets, exposed rig housings. When they brushed my collar, the rig turned into an antenna. The sensation of being contacted directly through hardware is different from any organic assault. It does not arrive through nerves in the usual way. One moment my thoughts were my own, reduced to a small, hard knot centered around fear and procedure. The next, something else was there, pressing against them. It did not ask questions. Questions imply gaps in knowledge, a desire to fill them. This felt more like a hand sorting through drawers. It opened whatever it could reach, briefly examined the contents, then dumped them onto a table somewhere I could not see. Everything I had ever seen of Theta 9 unspooled. Landing zones, prefab structures, the interior of the tent ward, waking faces of the damaged men I had worked on. Other theaters surfaced too, different skies, different soil, different uniforms. All of it flickered past, shorn of context. I felt it hesitate at my older memories, the ones from before the rig. Those were more chaotic, less compressed, not yet shaped by the routines of my current work. It sifted them anyway, though more slowly. Childhood streets. The faces of people whose names I had not spoken in years. The pattern recognized them as irrelevant and discarded them, but not before I had to feel them again, stripped of their place in time. Around us, the others were being processed in parallel. I sensed them through the lattice, not as individuals, but as data streams. Each mind, each memory sequence slotted into a larger framework. The hive was building something in real time, a construct made of experience. The more it found, the more channels it opened. At some point, the line between what was being taken and what was being written back blurred. New associations appeared in my thoughts, obviously foreign. A certain arrangement of glass shards on a dune linked to the sense of a particular frequency spike. The sight of a standard exosuit helmet tied to an internal representation of stress fractures within it. The hive was not content to read. It was integrating our knowledge into its own resonance maps, then replicating optimized versions back into our neural tissue, perhaps in preparation for using us later. Time lost coherence. The process might have lasted seconds or hours. Buried under all of it lay a simple fact. The rig was a conduit. As long as it remained intact, the flow would continue, and everything I had ever known, every operation, every interrogation, would end up as part of a crystalline intelligence's toolset. I found a thin edge of control in that realization and held on to it. The rig had safeguards, overload limits, kill switches. They were designed to protect operators from catastrophic input and to prevent external compromise. All of them assumed that someone with hands would be available to flip them. At that moment, no such luxury existed. But there were also software pathways, low-level routines, failover modes that could be triggered by thought patterns alone if you knew where they were. I had spent years in these collars. I knew where they were. The idea of turning the rig into a weapon had occurred to me before, in abstract. We had run models. None of them were approved for field use. The risk to the operator was categorized as absolute. I followed the remembered path anyway. The command was simple at its core: disable all dampers, open every channel, feed back whatever comes in at multiplied gain. Turn the bridge into a loop with no exit. I pushed the sequence through a brain that was already half compromised. For a moment I thought it had failed. Then something in the hardware complied. The flow changed. The hive's input had been ordered, if alien. Frequencies selected for efficiency. Routes optimized. When the feedback circuit closed, that order collapsed. Everything the rig was receiving, it began to send back, not as neatly tagged streams, but as incoherent noise, phase-shifted and amplified. Memories of different worlds overlapped with each other and with the present sensory feed. The hive's own resonant signals came back at it, twisted, out of phase, folded into knots. The lattice screamed. There is no better word for it. The structural ringing that had underlain everything rose until it exceeded the capacity of my auditory nerves. Beyond that point, I felt it only in the way the world shook. The spines of the central structure vibrated at rates they had not been built to handle. Microfractures blossomed along their lengths. Light within the glass filaments surged, blew out, and died. Sections of the lattice went dark as the conduits overloaded. All of that passed in less time than it takes to form a sentence. The feedback wave did not differentiate between enemy and operator. The rig's internal components overheated instantly. Something inside my collar exploded, not physically but electrically, a sudden, violent misrouting of current that burned along the interface leads. Pain finally got through, raw, unfiltered, white. For a moment, I knew nothing else. Then the floor came up. The collapse happened in layers. Spines buckled and snapped. Segments of the chamber roof sheared away and dropped, slower than gravity alone would dictate, slowed by structural flex. Sheets of glass rained down, shattering on impact. Dust filled the air, thick enough to be a fluid. My suit registered impacts. Some were probably other bodies hitting me. Others were debris. A long crack ran under my left shoulder as something heavy slid over it. The resonance cut off mid-scream. The sudden absence was worse than the presence. It left behind a silence so absolute it felt like vacuum, as if all sound had been torn out of the world. I do not remember losing consciousness. I remember fragments of being half awake under shifting weight, unable to tell which way was up. At some point, distorted voices bled through my helmet from external speakers, too garbled to parse, then cut to clean as a recovery line connected. I felt the tug of winches on my harness. The next clear memory is of gray, filtered light and the interior of a shuttle, cots strapped to the deck, medtechs moving between them. My rig was gone. The base of my skull felt raw, as if someone had scraped away layers with a dull blade. They said I was lucky to be alive. Luck is a word people use when they need to disguise the fact that they do not understand the distribution of outcomes. Theta 9's chamber registered as destroyed on the follow-up scans. The collapse had sealed the fracture deep under rubble. The central resonance node's signature vanished from theater-level monitoring. Command marked the operation as a successful neutralization of a key enemy asset. The casualties from our element and the original recon company were listed in adjacent columns. There were too many names and not enough space on the report display. They put me in a rear area ward after emergency stabilization. The walls were thicker there. The lights could be dimmed further. I shared the space with other neurological losses, men whose implants had cooked, women whose optic nerves had been scorched by flash events, a handful of soldiers whose stated identities no longer matched any records. Debriefing sessions came and went. Intelligence officers asked for detailed descriptions of the hive's behavior, its structural layout, the way it had handled our memories. I gave them what I could. Some of it came out clean, in neat, sequential reports. Some of it emerged as fragments that had to be assembled later. I told them what mattered most, that the structure under Theta 9 had not felt like a complete organism. It had carried the imprint of higher-level coordination, signals coming in from directions I could not localize. The patterns in its resonance grid suggested it was one node in a distributed array. They asked how sure I was. I told them I was as sure of that as I was of my own name, and slightly less sure of the latter than I used to be. They wrote it down. Days in the ward bled together. Time was marked less by clock cycles than by the internal recombination of what was left inside my head. Memories do not sit quietly after they have been pulled up and handled. They move. The hive had stirred them all, mine and others, then thrown them into turbulence. I would lie on the bunk and watch scenes that I knew did not belong to me. Standing on a beach I had never visited, under a sky with 2 moons, eating in a mess hall with a layout I did not recognize, surrounded by faces I had never met but whose names surfaced with absolute certainty. Moving through trenches on a world of red dust and low gravity. Some of them were probably from the missing recon company. Others might have leaked in from previous subjects I had worked on, dislodged by the overload. At this point, there was no reliable way to tell. What remained consistent was Theta 9's sound. Even with my rig removed and the port sealed, I could hear the faint ringing of glass. It did not match any external source. In the quiet of the ward at night, with ventilation systems running at low, with soft-footed medtechs moving down the aisle, I could still hear that distant note. Sometimes it wavered, as if responding to something far away. Sometimes it held steady for hours. It never entirely stopped. They told me the hive was gone. The scans were clean. Orbital sweeps detected only rubble and subsurface fractures. Destruction is a comforting concept when you need closure. Distributed systems do not respect it. You can break a node and still leave the network intact. Some parts may even adapt better after pruning. If the hive had been reading my thoughts as thoroughly as I believed, then it knew as much about our methods as we now knew about its. It had seen the rig's capabilities, our doctrines, our fallback positions, the weaknesses in our implants. Somewhere, in some other chamber under some other sky, it would integrate those insights into its resonance maps. That thought does not keep me awake. Nothing so dramatic. Wakefulness requires a clear boundary between sleep and not sleep. The line is blurred now. Instead, I drift. Sometimes I am in the tent on Theta 9, fitting probes to a damaged officer's scalp. Sometimes I am under the collapsed chamber, pinned in rubble while the last echoes of the hive's scream fade out. Sometimes I am walking across a field of water rather than glass, sky reflected at my feet, a world that never existed for me but feels as real as any. The war goes on, in other sectors, on other worlds. New orders will come for men like me, if they can find enough of us with intact ports and functioning rigs. Neural specialists are a resource. You expend them until they burn out, then you requisition more. They have cleared me for limited duty. No more frontline dives, no more field deployments. I am to serve as reference, an archive of patterns encountered, a source of training data for new algorithms meant to detect early signatures of hive interference. They consider it a dignified way to use what remains. What remains is questionable. I record this because it is part of the deposition they asked for, and because putting the sequence into words pins it down, however briefly. Each sentence is an attempt to hold the fragments in one place long enough to examine. When I stop speaking, they will store the file in some secure node, attach it to my record, cross-reference it with others. My voice will become part of the war's documentation, a minor strand in the greater pattern. The hive does something similar, only without consent. Sometimes, lying in the dark, I imagine worlds I have never seen, each with its own chamber of glass or stone or metal, each with a central structure attuned to local conditions, each seeded with captured minds. I imagine the resonance paths that run between them, faster than any conventional signal, carried along fault lines in reality I do not understand. We collapsed one chamber. We broke one node. The network adjusted. In the end, what I did under Theta 9 may be recorded as a tactical victory. It prevented, for a time, the local dissemination of sensitive data. It gave command new insight into the enemy's methods. It justified the expense of hardware and bodies. For me, it stripped away enough of my own continuity that I now exist as something like those men on my cots used to be. Present, functional, questionable, in terms of ownership of what is inside my skull. The ring of glass remains. It threads through every waking moment and most of the drifting ones. Perhaps it is just trauma. Perhaps it is the echo of the feedback loop, burned into neural tissue. Perhaps it is a residual connection to something that still hums beyond the range of our instruments. I do not know. What I do know is that when I close my eyes and let the sound rise to the surface, I can feel it align with something. Not here, not in this ward, not even on Theta 9 anymore. Somewhere else, another node, another chamber, another lattice growing around another set of bodies, tuning itself on the basis of what we taught it. The glass is singing to itself across the dark, and parts of my mind sing back whether I will it or not. That is the kind of wound this war leaves. Not missing limbs, not shrapnel scars, just a mind that no longer belongs entirely to the thing that wears it. The end. The story powers down like systems entering a night cycle, one light at a time. Let your thoughts do the same. Rest.